The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Texas Mortgage Bankers Association's Education Webinar Series, part of the Education and Endowment Committee led this year by Pam Jenkins and Dave Toggenbaugh. I'm Stephen Bertrand, and I'll be moderating today's webinar titled Legislative Insight, Unpacking Hot Topics, Special Sessions, and Interesting Cases. We'd love to hear from you. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar using the questions or chat window. If you have additional questions, please feel free to email Carol at the email address on the presentation slide. I'd like to introduce today's presenter. John Fleming serves as the General Counsel for the Texas Mortgage Bankers Association and is a longtime banking law and financial services attorney. He also has an active arbitration and mediation practice. He regularly speaks on banking, mortgage law, electronic transactions, and other financial services topics. Okay, let's get started. John, the presentation is all yours.
Thank you, Stephen, and I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you and the members of TMBA. I want to start by saying I consider it a great privilege to serve as the General Counsel for the Texas Mortgage Bankers. I believe we have wonderful members and wonderful, energetic people, and I'm so delighted to be able to be part of what TMBA does. We live, and I don't have to tell you this, you know, we live in a quickly changing environment, both financially and regulatory. And I thought what we would do today is take a look back at what has transpired since the legislature wrapped up its regular session and wrapped up the special sessions relating to Texas, and talk a little bit about what we believe is still out there on some legislative issues, because when it comes to the legislature, the past is always prologue. And what I mean by that is every session there are bills that are introduced that may not get passed, but those issues may continue and carry over, and you will see the same bill or modification of that bill again in the next legislative session. So the first thing I want to talk about is a bill that did pass in the regular session of the bill, but has received some headwinds from implementation, and that is the so-called Death Star bill. House Bill 2127 by Chairman Dustin Burrows out of Lubbock. This is the bill that we reported on during the session that would preempt municipal ordinances to the extent that they may conflict with certain provisions of local law. For our standpoint, where we were targeting our concern and our support of the bill was the portion of the bill that basically said if the finance code addresses an issue, then a state or then a county government or municipal government cannot come behind and issue ordinances in that space because the finance code trumps it. Now, from our standpoint, our main concern was that some municipalities that had attempted to pass laws regulating the payday industry business and the auto title lending industry might decide to go further and do things like issue moratoriums on foreclosures or begin to impose certain consumer legislation that is outside of what municipalities and local government have traditionally done, but you've seen precedent for that, particularly back in some northern states and East Coast states, where municipalities started to come in and regulate our industry. We supported HB 2127 because of that. It goes further, however, of course, as you might expect, and deals with preempting issues relating to the labor code, that is, the ability of cities to enact regulations as to how employers deal, particularly with outside contractors and laborers in the heat of the summer, or in this case, in the middle of a severe freezing event. But the biggest and perhaps most contentious issues related around the ability of a city through its zoning and other regulations to overstep what state law has done. The law did pass overwhelmingly. The governor signed it. It was one of his priorities. But a Travis County District Judge has declared that that bill is unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has stayed that ruling, but the lawsuit will be ongoing. So we don't know how that bill will turn out. It could be that by the time we get to the next legislative session, which is now less than 365 days away, we will be looking at some attempts to perhaps revive that if the bill is not upheld by the courts, although I predict it has a strong possibility of being upheld. If you followed our legislative updates, then you know that once we got through the first and second special sessions, which focused mainly on property tax relief, we came to the third called special session, which dealt with border issues, and you had particular hearings that did involve our industry because there were attempts and bills filed to react to a particularly concerning to many members of the legislature real estate development north of Houston called Colony Ridge. And we've reported about that in some of our legislative reporting from this fall. But let's talk a little bit about Colony Ridge, because I think that's an important development that we need to look at what's going on and the attempts that have been proffered to deal with that, because it does have some potential spillover effect to mortgage lending in general. Colony Ridge is a development of about 30,000 acres that sits north of Houston in Liberty County. And no one knows for sure, but it is estimated that currently there may be 30 or 40,000 people living in Colony Ridge, all of who have acquired their property from a developer who sells vacant lots. And because it is in the county, you do not necessarily have the same building restrictions that you would in a single-family residential development inside a municipality. The developer has not imposed a lot of stiff requirements on what dwellings should look like. And as a result, you have a wide variety of housing, including a lot of manufactured housing, some single-family housing, and in some cases, people move in an RV or an older, not very visually appealing trailer house that they'll move on site and maybe add 2. The reason that we're following this is because there have been bills introduced that would affect all of us in a broader sense. There was a bill introduced in the 3rd special session aimed particularly at Colony Ridge, but at anyone who sells lots and does seller financing. And it would have done 2 things. First of all, it would have required any person who sells land to verify that their buyer is authorized to work in the United States. And it would have required people who rent property to verify that the people that they rent property to be authorized to work in the United States. This was considered very disturbing among the real estate community. The realtors were concerned about this. The lenders were concerned about this. The bill was introduced but was not given a hearing during the 3rd special session. But it again previews the kind of bills that we may likely see when we get to the 2025 legislative session. During this 3rd special session, there were other bills aimed at limiting the foreign ownership of real estate. Lois Poforce, who had a bill that passed the Senate but died in the House, refiled that bill. A state representative filed an identical bill on that. There were about 4 or 5 bills that got filed in this special session relating to restricting foreign ownership. So let's go over a few of those because, as I said, the past is prologue. And what we saw in the regular session, what we saw in the special sessions, I anticipate we can once again see in some form when we get to the 2025 legislative session. The bills come in a couple of varieties. Let's look at the Cody Harris bill. The Cody Harris bill that was filed in the special session was House Bill 93. This bill was pretty much identical to what he filed in the regular session, House Bill 1075. It only applied to agricultural land, and it would only apply to agricultural land owned by a foreign government or an entity associated with a foreign government. The bill would have declared any conveyance to a prohibited entity to be void. One of the differences about this bill versus some of the other bills is this applied to any foreign government, not just hostile governments. And it would include investments made in agricultural land by foreign public pension funds, for instance. Now, here's how that would impact us. First of all, we learned during the past legislative session that there are many of our developer friends who will join venture with citizens of a foreign government or get funding from pension funds from foreign governments to acquire agricultural land that they're acquiring for the purpose of turning into residential subdivisions. Under the Harris bill, as it was filed, that kind of investment could be prohibited. It needs some work. We do think that Representative Harris is willing to listen to some of our concerns on that. When the bill came up for hearing in the legislative session and regular session, he did indicate that he liked some of our approaches to some of these other bills. but I expect something along the Harris bill to come back. But part of the problem with these bills, and the Harris bill particularly, is that when you declare the transaction void, every downstream transaction then becomes void. So if you had a prohibited buyer who acquired agricultural land, that land was then developed into a single-family subdivision. A lot was sold to a home builder. A home builder constructed a house on that, sold the house to a consumer, and we financed it. Here's what that would look like under the Harris bill. Because the original transaction was void, then the transaction, the conveyance from the developer to the home builder is void, and thus the conveyance from the home builder to the consumer is void, and thus the mortgage lien to secure the loan made by one of our members would likewise be void. That's the problem with the approach that Representative Harris has taken. By declaring all of those transactions void, you create uncertainty downstream in second and third and fourth tier transactions. And because if the foreign ownership is varied in second or third tier subsidiaries, you cannot necessarily be assured that you've done due diligence to find out who the actual owner of these are. Let's contrast that with the approach taken by Lois Polkhurst in her bill, Senate Bill 51. In the regular session, it was SB 147. This bill, as it finally got worked through the session, thanks to a lot of her collaboration with us, looked a whole lot better. It wasn't perfect, but it was a whole lot better at the end of session than the beginning. And here's why. First of all, the bill, as it wound up passing the Senate, did not name a specific country, but rather said that a prohibited buyer would be a foreign government that had been designated as hostile by the National Security Director in their annual report, and entities owned or controlled by those governments or citizens of those hostile nations. The problem with that bill is that the United States does recognize dual citizenship, so you still could have citizens of a targeted country who are also U.S. citizens, and there are some concerns that the bill could mean in some instances that U.S. citizens could be restricted from acquiring interest in agricultural. She did try to address some of this by saying that the acquisition of a residence or smart parcel was excluded from the act. We thought that that was a good step, but to the extent that you do have these foreign citizens who are working to become U.S. citizens or who are U.S. citizens, but might have dual citizenship and might want to invest for the purpose of building a subdivision or invest in rental real estate, the bill would prohibit that, and so the bill didn't quite get to where it needed to be. Now, she was very responsive to us throughout the session, and her staff was. She took our recommendations that a transaction where you had a prohibited person in ownership was not void, but could become the subject of a receivership and divestiture proceeding initiated by the Attorney General. That would mean that our land would be more secure and that in this divestiture proceeding, a lender should be able to be made whole. We expect that a version of that bill would return next session. There was another bill that the governor vetoed that we thought might get expanded and included on the call for the special session. That did not occur, and that is Senate Bill 47 by Chairman Brian Hughes. And let's talk about how that bill started and how it wound up and why I think it's important and why we need to look at that for next session. Originally, Senator Hughes was concerned that large Wall Street investment funds are acquiring single-family residences for investment and taking them out of availability for a consumer to buy that by holding them and acquiring these for investment purposes. There is some evidence that Wall Street entities like BlackRock had some funds that were acquiring significant numbers of residences in suburban areas and urban areas across the state. Under Senator Hughes' original version of this bill, you would have to register with the Texas Real Estate Commission if you are an institutional investor and acquired 10 or more properties. Now, here's the problem with that. There's no definition of who an institutional investor is. And our reading of the bill meant that a small investor who invests and acquires real estate for the purpose of rehabbing it and either flipping it or retaining it for rental would have been required to register under this bill. From our standpoint, as an industry group, it didn't distinguish how you acquired it. So if a mortgage servicer acquired more than 10 residences in the course of a year, and they're going to be all of our larger servicers are going to fall in that category, they would have had to register and report on how many properties that they acquired, because there was no attempt to distinguish between BlackRock, a small investor, and a lender who acquires property in foreclosure. Senator Hughes was very responsive to our concerns, and at the end of the session, that bill got converted to a bill that would have directed the Texas A&M Real Estate Center to prepare a study and report on institutional buyers of single-family residential property. The governor vetoed that because they hadn't passed property tax reform. It got filed during special session, but the governor never added that to the call of the special session. That bill did not advance, but there is no reason why the Texas A&M Real Estate Center cannot go ahead and prepare that study. They've got the access to all that data through CoreLogic. They may be intending to do that. We're encouraging them to do that because, as I said, past is prologue. And Senator Hughes' bill was only one of several bills aimed at institutional buyers of single-family residences. There was a bill in the House that was filed, I believe, by Representative Gina Hinojosa that would have required any institutional owner, or anybody, any buyer of any seller of real estate to have a 30-day period where an institutional or corporate buyer could not buy your house. And that 30-day window was there to give first-time home buyers and persons who are actually buying it for occupancy an opportunity to buy that home. That bill did not get a hearing, but there is still concern among several members of the House that buying single-family residences by investors are driving up the prices and contributing to the affordability issue. So you very well may see these bills come back in the next special session. Not special, well, we have a special session, but I don't think at this point we're going to have a special session. We can talk about that. But I do think that these are bills that you may be seeing in the next legislative session. We are now in the middle of primary season, and we are in the middle of probably one of the bitterest election cycles at the state level that I have ever seen. And bitter from the standpoint of you have the governor fighting with the House of Representatives. You have the lieutenant governor fighting with the Speaker of the House and with the House of Representatives. And you have the Attorney General who is fighting with the House of Representatives because of their voting articles of impeachment. So these are all Republicans fighting Republicans, and they control currently the Texas House. But they're still fighting with one another. The governor is very much unhappy that the House did not pass his bill on school vouchers. He is targeting a number of incumbent Republican members in their primaries and supporting their opponents in hopes of getting persons more favorably inclined to vote for his school voucher bill next session. You have a couple of other large donors who are also actively involved in pushing and opposing Republican incumbent members who oppose school vouchers. You may have seen in the reporting over the last 48 hours that a national figure has donated $6 million, a single donation of $6 million to Governor Abbott to help him in his push for school choice. The problem with that is, in my opinion, a failure to acknowledge that the 21 members of the House who are Republicans and who voted against the school voucher bill are rural Republicans, many of whom are in counties that have no private schools, so there wouldn't be any choice. This would just be money coming out of the coffers of the state to support private schools, and in those rural counties, there may not even be a private school. Plus, in those counties, often the school district is one of the largest employers. It is part of the fabric of those rural communities, and the school boards and the teachers are likely not supportive of the governor's initiative. It is thought that those members who voted against, who are Republican, because most Democrats almost universally voted against the governor, but the Republicans who voted against it from these rural areas really were voting what their constituents wanted them to do. Well, that theory is likely to get tested in the Republican primary, which will be held in March, and we'll see whether or not the governor is right or the incumbents were right with their votes. We were at an event with Speaker Phelan earlier this week, and Speaker Phelan says that in the polling that he has seen, the two issues that are on the minds of Republican primary voters that are at the top are border issues and employment and economic issues. So that he says that, for instance, the impeachment vote doesn't poll in the top 10 issues. And he also says among those that the vote on school vouchers does not seem to be polled. Now, polls are polls, and we won't, but the real poll is when people vote, and we don't know how that's going to turn out. But that's sort of the lay of the land as we go in to this primary season. We're looking at those house races, state house races in particular. There will be a number of our friends and colleagues who have decided not to come back. Andrew Murr from Junction, who has been very helpful to us, has announced his retirement. Doc Anderson from the Waco area, who's been a longtime ally, has announced his retirement. Hugh Shine, who headed an important tax committee and was always accessible to us, has announced his retirement, and there will be others. So it's going to look different next session. We don't know how it's going to look, but we do know that it's going to look different than it did this past session. So with that, let me at this point stop and see if there are any questions. And if not, then we'll go on. And I want to talk about a couple of pieces of litigation with you. But first, let me see if you've got any questions.
John, thank you for pausing for questions. I don't see any at this time, and want to remind everyone that you can send in questions through the chat or questions panel. So no questions at this time, and we'll keep watching.
All right, great. Thank you. I mentioned earlier that there had been a large amount of interest in the Colony Ridge development, including a special hearing on Colony Ridge that focused a lot on whether their infrastructure was right, if they were targeting and selling primarily to undocumented people, and other issues. And the result of those hearings, where law enforcement testified that there were not any increased criminal issues or gang activity that you didn't see in other largely growing populations. You didn't see any violations of Texas environmental laws that were markedly higher than you would see in any development of a similar size. The result of all those legislative hearings appeared to be that the developer was doing what they needed to do as they needed to do it. The issues are there, but they are in many subdivisions, and this one was no worse, no better than a lot of the others. There was a lot of concern raised, particularly in the media, that the developer was targeting particularly the Hispanic community and not doing anything to verify that the people who are buying lots and potentially building houses out there are lawful residents of this country. Well, in late December, we have a new player who shows up in this controversy. the Consumer Financial Protection, who in December sued Colony Ridge, alleging violations, along with the Department of Justice on some counts, of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, of Truth in Lending, of the Fair Housing Act, and the Interstate Land Sales Act, and violating the provision of Dodd-Frank relating to CFPB's ability to declare a lender to be engaging in unfair, deceptive, or abusive practices. That's really kind of open-ended. The lawsuit is curious to me for a couple of reasons. Number one, Colony Ridge is selling vacant lots, and under long-standing guidance that we had, it was our impression, and I think the impression in the industry, that the ability to repay, the requirement to verify the ability to repay, and other provisions relating to a real estate mortgage transaction did not apply to the sale of a vacant lot because you're not selling a dwelling. Well, lo and behold, CFPB, for some reason, has decided, as part of the basis of their lawsuit, to raise that Colony Ridge was not doing anything to verify the ability of these borrowers to repay the loan, even though they're not buying dwellings, they're buying vacant lots. I think that surprised a lot of people. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that develops. I have not heard any knowledgeable, informed source say that they believe that the CFPB is on the right track with that. A couple of the things, though, that I do think are critically important for us to consider are one of the things that CFPB took after Colony Ridge was sort of a reverse redlining and reverse discrimination. And they go to great length in their complaint to complain about Colony Ridge developers marketing only to Hispanics and using mainly marketing materials and advertising on Spanish language radio markets. And as a result, CFPB is saying, well, you're engaging in reverse discrimination and you're engaging in deceptive and predatory practices because you're putting them these loans that they can't afford and they don't understand. I think that it will be interesting to see how those allegations play out. And we're watching that. That lawsuit was just filed in December, and it will be one to watch, although I'm not sure how quickly that case will advance because of what I want to bring to your attention next. And if we can, now be a good time for me to share my screen with you. So, are you able, can you see that? We good?
Yes, we can see the slide there.
Right, thank you. Try to get you off my screen. So, there we go. That helps some. So, I want to talk to you about a very important question that is now pending before the United States Supreme Court, and that is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau constitutional? The slides that you have, and I'll be happy to share these, I'll send them to Stephen afterwards, come from a presentation I made to the Austin Bar Association back in November. But I think that this is something that we need to closely watch, because according to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals out of New Orleans.
Don, excuse me, I was going to suggest if you want to click enable editing there at the top of the screen and then slideshow.
All right, I'll do that.
And it might be easier for the attendees to view the slides.
Let's see.
You'll click enable editing and then slideshow.
Stephen, I'm having a
And you may be able to go directly to slideshow and just select that. There you go.
All right, now let me.
And then slideshow at the top, or
Yeah.
the top middle there, right there.
All right, we'll do it then. We're not going to
From beginning. There we go.
way through these, but I do want to take you through some of these slides because according to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals out in New Orleans, the funding structure of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is unconstitutional. And therefore, all of the regulations and any of the enforcement activities that the CFPB has undertaken since 2010 are tainted and likely void. And let's go through this. First of all, let's look, and I want you to see how many of these acts the CFPB now has regulation over, because under Dodd-Frank, they took what was being regulated by HUD and several other agencies and consolidated them under the CFPB, particularly with respect to depository institutions. But they've got the Dodd-Frank Act, they've got the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the Fair Credit Billing Act, the Fair Debt Collection Act, Ramlich-Wiley, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, and those of you who are now trying to deal with that know that we've got questions there. Homeowner Protection Act of 1998, Truth in Lending, Truth in Savings, and any number of other acts. So that you've got this broad regulatory structure under the CFPB. Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir on this, but I think it's important to go back and look at this history as we look at how critical this case is. As we have seen in the Colony Ridge litigation, there is one provision of Dodd-Frank that gives the CFPB almost unlimited authority to declare a particular practice as unfair, abusive, or deceptive. And we see how that can be used in part in the Colony Ridge case. And that is one where CFPB attempts to regulate and pass regulation through litigation rather than rule. I'm going to skip over the CE law case, which has to do with whether or not the original structure on how the director of CFPB is appointed is constitutional. If you want the slides, you can go through those. I want to come back and talk about this next case. which is the and now I want to talk about the Consumer Financial Services Association versus the CFPB, because that is one that is currently before the Supreme Court and could have significant impact on our industry. We need to start by saying that the plaintiff, Consumer Financial Services Association, represents the payday industry. And in this lawsuit, they were challenging a CFPB rule relating to business practices in the payday industry. The rule attacked certain practices under the CFPB's authority to regulate unfair, deceptive, or abusive practices. And the trade association in this case said that because the funding structure of the CFPB is unconstitutional, the payday lending rule is invalid, and any enforcement actions are invalid. So let's look a minute at how the CFPB is funded. You probably will remember this, but just in case, when they created the CFPB, they bypassed the traditional funding mechanism for most agencies. And the legislation says that CFPB gets its money directly from the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve gets its money from its members. So as a result, CFPB never has to go before Congress to get its budget approved. They are completely isolated from that process. The way this works is, on an annual basis, the director of the CFPB sends a letter request to Chairman Powell and says, this is how much money we need. And the Federal Reserve is just supposed to write that check as long as it doesn't exceed 10% of the Federal Reserve's revenue for that year. That's how that works. So in this case, there has been an allegation made that it bypasses the constitutional requirement in Article 1, Section 9, that funds drawn from the Treasury can only be drawn in public money spent if it is appropriated by Congress. And because this isn't appropriated by Congress, it's exempt. And the CFPB insulation is double insulation because its request to the Federal Reserve bypasses Congress, and the Federal Reserve's budget bypasses Congress and is not subject to appropriation. So the CFPB funds don't go to the Treasury, but to the special fund created by the Feds. In it, the Fifth Circuit held that the Bureau's funding cannot be upheld in the Appropriations Clause, and it violates the separation of powers. And therefore, everything that the CFPB has done is tainted. That case has now been argued in front of the Supreme Court, and is now pending before the Supreme Court. Now, at first blush, that seems like a win for the financial services industry. I'm not so sure, and I'm kind of a contrarian on this, because if you do not have the CFPB vested with authority to make the rules that they have, what happens to all of the rules that we have spent the last 10 or 11 years as an industry and spent millions of dollars trying to comply with, creating loan origination systems that comply with the disclosure rules, creating our origination procedures and protocols to deal with issues of ability to repay, all of the loss mitigation things that come into place that our servicers have been dealing with. And if those rules are now void, then what are the rules? Do we go back to the rules that we had and that were in place before 2010 and Dodd-Frank was passed? Who now makes the rules? Do we now have various regulators making the rules, or do we have as many rule makers as you have district court judges in this state or in this country? I think that if the Supreme Court were to uphold the Fifth Circuit, that it would create a good bit of chaos and uncertainty in the industry that would not be good for us. Now, I do think that there are some alternatives for the Supreme Court to go to. The Supreme Court could do as it has in other cases, and if it finds that the funding structure is unconstitutional, they could give Congress an 18-month window to sort it out. They could do it in a way that didn't challenge any of the and left intact the agency rules. We don't know what's going to happen. We expect that case to be decided this session. The problem beyond CFPB is, as some of the Supreme Court justices have indicated, particularly Justice Thomas, if the funding structure for CFPB is unconstitutional, what about the funding for the Federal Reserve? What about the funding for the Office of the Comptroller of Currency? There are probably 15 or 16 federal agencies and commissions that have a structure similar to the CFPB, and their budgets may be funded from an industry group, and you're calling all of that into question. So you could have a real chaotic structure. Imagine if now the Supreme Court upholds the Fifth Circuit opinion, and then following that, somebody challenges the way the Federal Reserve Bank system has been together, or the Federal Home Bank system has been put together. I don't anticipate that the Supreme Court will go that far. I think that the Supreme Court will be split. Justice Kavanaugh is on record as having pointed out, for instance, that Congress has the right to revisit the funding structure of the CFPB any particular Congress. That can be changed. It only takes a majority of the House and a majority of the Senate to amend the funding structure. And if that is the case, is it truly unconstitutional? Well, we'll find out probably sometime in the next 6 months as that case comes down the pipe. And with that, we'll open the floor for questions.
John, I'm just checking with Carol on questions. We don't see any at this time. Reminding the attendees, if you have any questions, send those in through the chat or questions panel. Okay, and Carol confirms no further questions.
All right, well, thank you for the opportunity to visit with you today. I think All of you know how to find me, and if you don't, we can get that contact information to you. I love you and appreciate all of you, and hope to see you.
John, thank you for taking time to share your knowledge and experience with us. Thank you all for attending, and we hope you've learned more and enjoyed the presentation. TMBA continues to bring you great webinars like this one. Please check out the homepage at texasnba.org for the upcoming schedule. Thanks again, everyone, and that concludes our webinar.